Guadalcanal, January 1943. The jungle was so thick with heat and fear that even breathing felt dangerous. Marines lay pinned in the mud, hunted by Japanese snipers hidden high in the trees, silent, patient, merciless. And in the middle of this nightmare stood a young lieutenant with a rifle his own men mocked as a mail-order toy. They laughed at him when he brought it into battle. They doubted him when he clinged it like a lifeline. But over the next 4 days, when the forest became a killing ground and the enemy's bullets carved terror into every inch of the air, that same rifle would turn him into the most unlikely savior on the island. This is how a ridiculed weapon, and the quiet man who carried it, became the only thing standing between his unit and death. Second Lieutenant John George was not born into privilege or pedigree. He came to the war not as a decorated marksman, but as a hunter, a civilian who had learned to track deer in quiet woods, to steady his breath and to wait. When he shipped out with the 132nd Infantry Regiment to the Pacific Theater, he wore his uniform like armor, but he carried his hope tucked under his arm, a civilian-grade, mail-order hunting rifle. Not a sniper rifle, not a military-issue firearm, but his own. To his fellow soldiers, this was folly. In a world where snipers trained on shooting ranges, refined in specialized schools, his rifle was a relic unworthy. They called it a toy, a civilian's novelty, a joke. Still, John George treated it with reverence. Every night, among the racket of war waves of machine gun fire, the crackle of mortar shells exploding in the treetops, tree lines shuddering with each concussion, he cleaned the rifle carefully. He polished its barrel, oiled its bolt, and methodically zeroed his iron sights under moonlight. He was meticulous, almost obsessive. He knew this was no standard-issue tool. This was his life, his only lifeline in the madness of Guadalcanal. At first, he feared that the mocking voices were right. Every missed shot, every second when he was ordered to step aside, gnawed at him. What if the rifle jammed? What if the spread was too wild in jungle undergrowth, with humidity messing with his aim? What if, when the moment came, he failed? These thoughts lurked in his mind like the unseen enemy among the branches. Guilt washed over him, guilt at being different, guilt for trusting something so fragile. But he could not surrender his rifle, not only because it was his, but because he believed, on some instinctive level, that it might save lives. As the men prepared for action west of Point Cruz, whispers followed him through the mosquito-filled nights. Bring your toy? Don't get yourself killed, kid. But John George did not answer. He just stared at the ruins in front of him, in the smoky dawn. He waited. He listened to the wind rustling the leaves, measured its breath. He remembered every tree, every bunker outline from their reconnaissance maps. And when he moved slow, slow as the turn of a page in his hunting journal, steady as a prayer. Then came the first shot. His target emerged momentarily, a flicker of movement, a glint of steel in the branches. He exhaled, squeezed, and felt the rifle buck slightly in his hands. The shot cracked. The man dropped. In that instant, something changed. That mail-order rifle was no longer a joke. It was real. And so was he. But as the body fell, the jungle seemed to hush, as though holding its breath, because far more snipers were watching. And in that silence, Lieutenant George knew the fight was just beginning. The next morning, the jungle felt different, sharper, hungrier, as though the trees themselves were leaning in to listen. The Marines advancing toward the ridgeline west of Point Cruz had barely taken 10 steps before the first Japanese sniper struck. A single shot, flat and cruel, ripped through the leaves and punched into a sergeant's helmet. Men dove for cover. Radios crackled. The air tightened. And somewhere above, hidden in a nest of branches, the enemy melted back into silence. The kind of silence that made even seasoned fighters feel small. John George pressed himself into the earth, hands trembling for a moment before he forced them still. He had expected fear, but not like this. Not the kind that enters your lungs and refuses to leave. The Marines were pinned, motionless, staring into a jungle that existed to deceive. Every patch of shade looked like a rifle barrel. Every rustle felt like death unfolding between the leaves. And George knew, with a sickening drop in his stomach, that the next move belonged to him. He crawled forward alone, inch by inch, letting mud smear across his uniform and sweat sting his eyes. His rifle lay flat against the ground, wood damp, metal sweating in the heat. He moved with the same patience he had learned stalking deer at dawn, slow enough that the forest forgot him, or at least ignored him. Ahead, he counted positions the Japanese favored, limbs high enough to see American helmets, but low enough to slip away after firing. He had studied their tactics. He understood their rhythm. And he felt them studying him in return. The second sniper revealed himself only for a heartbeat, a faint shift in the canopy, a silhouette crouched against a trunk. George froze. The world narrowed to the small iron notch of his sight. He calmed his breathing, slow, soft, controlled. The air smelled of wet bark and cordite. His fingers settled. The shot snapped. A thud echoed. And again, the forest seemed to recoil as another enemy vanished from the fight. But the Japanese were not amateurs. For every sniper George found, 2 more tested the Marines with phantom movements and feints. Their shots came from impossible angles, from shallow pits carved into roots, from foliage so dense a man could be 3 feet away and still invisible. Each crack of a rifle sent waves of panic through the pinned infantry. Men gritted their teeth, sweating, whispering curses under their breath, begging the forest to give them just one sign. Fear crawled between them like a living thing. George pushed deeper. The ground softened under him, sucking at his elbows as he navigated through rotting vegetation. Mosquitoes hovered around his face, whining in his ears like needles of sound. His heart pounded so hard he feared the enemy would hear it. He questioned himself, not once, but constantly. What if this is madness? What if they're waiting? What if I'm already in their sights? But doubt could not halt him. Lives behind him depended on whatever courage he could summon. He spotted the third sniper, not by sight, but by the faintest unnatural line in the leaves, the shadow of a rifle barrel barely protruding through a fern. A seasoned soldier might have overlooked it. A hunter would not. George steadied himself against a root, let his breath fall silent, and fired. The shot echoed like a small explosion. Leaves fluttered down like green snow. A shape slumped backward out of view, yet there was no triumph. Only dread. Because each kill made the enemy more alert, more deliberate, more patient. Hours passed. The heat grew thick and oppressive, coating his skin like a second layer of grime. The Marines behind him hardly dared to breathe. They trusted him now, not because they wanted to, but because they had no choice. And as the sun began to dip behind the tree line, the forest grew darker, louder, and far more dangerous. George knew this day would not end with 3 snipers. The Japanese would not retreat because of a single determined lieutenant. No, they would come back. In the night or before dawn, hidden in the branches, ready to pick off more men until the ground was carpeted with American casualties. And so he tightened his grip on the rifle that had once been mocked, feeling its familiar weight. The sun slid beneath the horizon, turning the world to shadows. And in that gathering darkness, John George understood the grim truth of what awaited him. The next 3 days would be a test not of marksmanship, but of endurance. Fear, and the absolute limits of one man's will. Night on Guadalcanal was not a darkness you adapted to. It was a darkness that swallowed you whole. By the time the moon climbed above the trees, the jungle had transformed into a labyrinth of shifting shadows and deceptive silence. John George lay prone on a bed of damp leaves, rifle pressed against his cheek, listening, really listening to every crackle, every tremor of the swaying canopy. Somewhere out there, unseen eyes studied him with equal patience. Snipers did not sleep. They waited. What began on the ridgeline became a 4-day duel of wills. Each sunrise arrived like a sentence, marking the start of another desperate contest between hunter and hunted. The Japanese snipers worked in teams. One man fired, another moved. A third watched for the slightest American mistake. Their discipline was chilling. They fired once and vanished. They changed positions constantly, their camouflage blending seamlessly with the trembling leaves. Even experienced scouts called them ghosts. But George had grown up tracking prey that left almost no trace. A snapped twig, a displaced leaf, a patch of moss that shouldn't have been touched. Out here, those instincts became life-saving tools. On the second morning, after hours of crawling through underbrush so tight it cut his arms, he caught a movement high in a banyan tree. Not a figure, just a faint tremor in a branch that should have been still. He raised his rifle slowly, every muscle tight with dread. One wrong sound and the sniper would see him first. Sweat trickled down his forehead, stinging his eyes. His breath thinned. He squeezed the trigger. The sniper toppled backward and disappeared through the leaves. The Marines behind him released a breath they didn't know they were holding, but victory was always short-lived. Within minutes, another shot cracked from the opposite direction, nearly taking off a radio operator's shoulder. George spun so fast his elbow hit a tree root. He didn't wait for a perfect sight picture. There was no time. He fired reflexively, trusting instinct more than vision. A cry echoed. Another enemy fell. But the near miss rattled him. His hands shook. He swallowed the rising panic. He reminded himself that fear didn't disqualify courage, it defined it. By the afternoon of the third day, exhaustion clung to him like a physical weight. His uniform was soaked in sweat and caked with soil. His throat burned with thirst. His knees trembled every time he shifted his position. Yet he pushed on because he understood what retreat meant. Every step backward cost another Marine his life. And this place, this hellish battlefield, demanded payment in blood. He followed a hunch toward a cluster of roots where the ground dipped just slightly, forming a natural hollow. The Japanese often hid in these depressions, firing upward through narrow slits of foliage. George lay flat, barely daring to blink. A faint glimmer of metal caught a sliver of sunlight. He steadied the rifle. A single clean shot echoed. The jungle answered with stillness. He had taken his 7th sniper, but the enemy adapted. By the 4th day, they watched for him specifically. They knew the shape of his rifle, the rhythm of his movements, the angle of his shots. They baited him with decoys, helmets on sticks, rustling bushes, false glints of light meant to lure him into exposing himself. One near disaster came when he spotted what looked like a rifle barrel between 2 branches. He lined up his shot, then felt a sudden chill, a hunter's instinct screaming that something was wrong. He didn't fire. Minutes later, a real shot rang out from another direction. If he had lifted his head even an inch, he would have died. By dusk, the air tasted of smoke and sweat, and the metallic tang of adrenaline. The Marines advanced only because of him. "Where's George?" became the quiet breath of men clinging to survival. They depended on a marksman they had once mocked. Sometimes they watched him work. Sometimes they refused to lift their eyes, fearing that even witnessing his duel might curse them. That evening, he caught the 10th sniper with a shot so precise it felt instinctive. Almost involuntary, a reflex honed by years of patience. The man fell forward out of the branches, hitting the ground like a dropped sack. The Marines murmured with a mix of awe and disbelief, but John George did not feel triumphant. He felt the edge of collapse. The 11th sniper fired at dawn on the 4th day, a brutal, expertly timed shot that narrowly missed a corporal's heart. George didn't hesitate. He ran toward the direction of the smoke, branches slashing his arms, feet sinking into mud. The world became a blur of movement and panic. He dove behind a fallen trunk, spotted a shadow shifting behind a tangle of vines, and fired a single decisive round. Silence. No return shot. Slowly the Marine stood. The air was still. The jungle felt empty, as though a great pressure had finally lifted. 11 snipers in 4 days, their deadliest threat eliminated by the man they once ridiculed. And as George lowered his rifle, breathing ragged, knees bruised, he understood that this wasn't glory. It was survival. A grim, necessary act in a place where hesitation meant death. He had endured the fear, the exhaustion, the doubts, and somehow emerged alive. But the battle may have ended. The questions in his heart had not. When the guns finally quieted west of Point Cruz, the silence felt almost hostile. It pressed against the ears, thick and unnatural, as though the jungle itself resented the absence of gunfire. John George sat with his back against a shattered palm trunk, hands still wrapped around the rifle that had become both his salvation and his burden. All around him, Marines moved slowly, cautiously, as if relearning how to walk without fear clawing at their spines. Some looked at him with newfound respect, some with disbelief, and some with the haunted stare of men who had witnessed too much. But none spoke. Not yet. They were still recalibrating what it meant to be alive. George stared at the ground, tracing invisible lines in the dirt with trembling fingers. The faces of the 11 snipers flickered behind his eyes, not clearly. Not in detail, but in the harsh flashes of memory. A silhouette in a banyan tree. A faint movement in the vines. A pair of eyes briefly meeting his through the canopy before his shot ended the moment forever. He felt no triumph in any of it. Only the strange, crushing heaviness that comes when survival demands a piece of your soul. He had hunted before, yes, but never like this. Never when the prey was another man waiting to kill his friend's Dot as the Marines prepared to push forward. An officer approached George with a hard, honest gaze. "You saved a lot of lives," he said quietly. "You kept the line moving." George nodded, but his voice failed him. How could he explain that he didn't feel like a hero? He felt like a man who had been stripped down to the raw core of instinct. A man who had done what he had to do, because not doing it meant letting others die. The rifle, once an object of ridicule, now felt heavier than steel. He wondered if he would ever lift it again without remembering the weight of each shot. That night, under a sky smeared with smoke and starlight, George tried to sleep. But sleep wouldn't come. Every time he closed his eyes, the jungle returned. The suffocating humidity, the rustling leaves concealing danger, the pulse of fear in his throat. He remembered waiting for his targets, listening for the smallest irregularity in the forest. He remembered the cold stillness that overtook him each time before he fired. These moments weren't glorious. They were surgical, merciless, necessary. And the necessity haunted him most of all. A young Marine sat down beside him, breaking the silence with a hesitant voice. "Sir, I owe you my life." George turned, surprised. The boy, barely 19, held his helmet in his hands, thumb tracing dents left by shrapnel. "If you hadn't taken out that sniper in the roots, I wouldn't be breathing." George tried to smile but managed only a faint curve of the lips. Gratitude felt misplaced. He didn't want thanks. He wanted understanding, and yet he knew that no words could truly explain what those 4 days had taken from him. Before dawn, a new patrol assembled. The jungle ahead remained unforgiving, and though the immediate threat had been crushed, they all knew that more danger awaited. As George rose, his legs trembled with fatigue. His rifle hung by his side, its wooden stock scraped, scarred, and darkened by sweat. A weapon forged by his own faith, tested by fire and fear. The Marines watched him with quiet reverence now, but that respect only deepened the unease twisting inside him. He never wanted to be admired for killing. He wanted to be remembered for protecting as they moved out. The air carried the scent of burned vegetation and distant salt from the ocean. The jungle groaned with morning life, birds calling, insects buzzing, branches creaking under the weight of damp air. But underneath the natural chorus was something else, a lingering echo of violence, a reminder that the line between life and death here was razor thin. George paused at the edge of a clearing and looked back. In the shifting light, he thought he saw the ghosts of the past 4 days lingering among the trees, faint, shapeless, just memories. He let out a slow breath, feeling the tremor in his chest. The men behind him waited. The path ahead demanded more courage, more endurance, more sacrifices. But he stepped forward anyway, not because he was fearless, but because he had learned that courage was something far more complicated, a quiet, relentless force that lived beneath the fear, pushing a person forward even when every part of them wanted to turn back. He moved into the jungle, into the unknown, carrying the rifle that had once been mocked, and the burden of every life he had saved, and every life he had taken, toward whatever waited next. In the days that followed, the front shifted, the battle lines crawled forward, and new objectives replaced old fears. But for George, the world never fully returned to what it had been before those 4 brutal days west of Point Cruz. Men slapped his back. Officers praised his marksmanship, and even hardened veterans spoke his name with a kind of awe, as though he'd become something larger than life, a figure carved from legend. But inside, George felt only the raw hum of exhaustion, the truth that legends are born not from glory, but from moments of desperation where survival depends on refusing to break. He sat one afternoon on a crate near the shoreline, staring at his rifle as waves rolled ashore with a dull, rhythmic hush. The sunlight glinted off the scratched barrel. It didn't look like a weapon worthy of Taylor's. It looked like what it was, a simple hunting rifle ordered from a catalog, carried into war because he trusted it more than anything the army could issue. Men passed by and glanced at him, some nodding with respect, others whispering about the lieutenant who dropped 11 snipers. He didn't correct them, but he didn't embrace it either. How could he explain that the number felt less like a badge and more like a weight he would carry long after the war? Yet something subtle had changed. Men who once laughed at his toy now asked him questions about patience, about reading the land, about keeping calm when fear threatened to choke you. They weren't asking about shooting. They were asking about surviving. And George realized slowly that this too was a kind of duty, not to boast, not to revel in what he had done, but to help others live through what lay ahead. One night, as campfires flickered in the dark and the distant rumble of artillery echoed like memories refusing to fade, a corporal sat beside him. "Sir," he said softly, "how'd you do it? How'd you keep going?" George didn't answer right away. He stared at the horizon as the sky bled into moonlight. Finally, after a long breath, he replied, "One moment at a time. Never the whole day. Never the whole fear. Just the next breath. And the one after that." The corporal nodded, absorbing the words the way a drowning man memorizes the shape of a rope. When George eventually left Guadalcanal, his rifle packed carefully in his kit, he carried no medals that matched the magnitude of what he'd done. But he carried something far more enduring, the quiet understanding that courage isn't loud. It isn't the roar of a charge or the applause after a victory. Courage is the silent choice a man makes in the worst moments, the choice to stand, to try, to refuse to let fear write the ending. Years later, when the war had ended and the world had rebuilt itself from ashes, George would write about his experiences, not with bravado, but with clarity, honesty, and a kind of tender respect for the men on both sides who lived and died in the shadows of the jungle. His story would spread slowly, carried by veterans' voices, by historians, by those who understood that not all heroes arrive in polished uniforms with perfect weapons. Some arrive with a mail-order rifle and an unshakable belief in their own two hands. And that is where the true meaning of his story lies, ending the lesson in the leaves, because the tale of John George is not about 11 snipers. It's not even about a rifle purchased through catalog pages. It's about the quiet, stubborn courage of an ordinary man who walked into a nightmare and refused to let fear define him. It's about the truth that bravery isn't granted by rank, nor crafted by equipment, nor born from applause. Bravery comes from the choices we make when everything around us is collapsing, the willingness to step forward when the world demands we retreat. His story reminds us that history is shaped not only by grand strategies or famous commanders, but by individuals who decide, in a single fragile moment, to rise above their doubts, to trust themselves, to protect others, to endure. And so the lesson echoes far beyond the jungles of Guadalcanal. Sometimes the tools we carry are mocked. Sometimes our abilities are doubted. Sometimes we are underestimated. But greatness often begins in the moment we choose to believe in who we are, and in what we can do, even when no one else does. That is the truth John George left behind. A truth as steady as a held breath, as sharp as a single shot, breaking the silence, and as enduring as the courage of an ordinary man who changed history in 4 relentless days.